Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the Delhi edition of today's newspaper and analyze the important articles relevant for your examination perspective, be it for the prelims or the mains examination, and also analyze the art of answer writing and how to improve your answer writing skills. Now, before we take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss for today, an announcement for all of you. As of now, we have launched the August Optional Carnival. Now, we have for the first time launched various different optionals in English medium, and a plethora of various different optionals are available for you to choose and aim for a better rank in the mains examination. After all, aiming for something good in mains without optional is kind of a pipe dream. So we realize that, and that is where the August Optional Carnival is there for all of you to avail and try to take any of the optional that you like and try to initiate the preparation thereby. For the first time on Unacademy Platform, history as well as geography in complete English medium has been launched on the Unacademy Platform. So do use the code MJOPT and thereby avail the maximum discount as possible. So do start studying and preparing for the optional as soon as possible. Now let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to discuss around 7 different topics, and all the topics have appeared in the Delhi edition of the newspaper, barring one of them, which I have chosen from the international edition of today's newspaper because it was relevant for the purpose of the prelims. So here, the first topic, moral pressure and human rights compliance. Now, this is about enforcement of human rights in various different countries and the issues that are faced thereby. So, this is relevant for your GS paper 2. Then, power play. This is about the hydropower projections and the hydroelectric power generation in the fragile ecosystem of the Himalayas, and because we have experienced the impact in the Teesta power project because of the landslide and because of the glacial lake outburst floods with greater frequency. So that raises a question mark on the very implementation of these hydropower plant projects. So this has again appeared in the editorial section. This is relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for your GS paper 3. Then, imports weaken Indian pharma industry. This is going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. Now then, some of the topics that we are going to discuss only relevant for your prelims, and a brief idea is important. So, WHO investigating suspected new polio strain. Yesterday we had discussed about the causes of the new polio cases the new polio case rather, which has emerged in the state of Meghalaya. Now, WHO has started investigating that. Then Supreme Court to examine the need for an environmental regulator. Just like you have regulator for the electricity boards, etc. So, is there a need for the environmental regulator? Now, rapid e-commerce growth could hit millions of retail stores and jobs. There was the statement made by the minister, and what are the implications of the e-commerce growth and what is the issue faced because of that. Then, earth whistles when lightning strikes. This has appeared in the science section of the international edition of the today's newspaper. And here, we are going to analyze the relevance and the importance of the magnetosphere in sustaining life on Earth, the Van Allen belt, and what is this new finding about the lightning which can further influence the space travel that all of us aim to have. So, these are the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. Without further ado, let us look into the first topic which has appeared in the editorial, that is moral pressure and human rights compliance. Now, let us understand the backdrop of this topic very briefly. This particular article talks about the fact that when it comes to human rights and enforcement of human rights, now there are various different mechanisms which have been adopted to ensure that human rights and the guidelines for human rights are followed across the world. you have various different NGOs, you have various different government agencies, all of them consistently keep a track of the human right violations wherever it happens, and they do their own bit in order to solve the crisis. Now, this talks about the fact that there are certain ways in which the human right violations are treated across the world. For example, when you consider a country like China, or when you consider a country like, let's suppose, North Korea or Russia, there have been significant amount of human rights violations in the past, and various different protests, they have emerged out of those violations. Now, in many of the cases, the states have come down quite heavily on the protesters. For example, the case with China. China comes down quite heavily on the protesters, be it the human rights violations in Tibet, be it the human rights violation in Xinjiang region of the Uyghur community. So, there have been various different mechanisms. Now, international community and the international world order reacts to these human rights violations in different ways. Now, this article analyzes which of them is actually helpful, and if it is not helpful, why it is so and what is the way forward. So, first of all, when we talk about the countries violating the human rights within their own territories, there is only a limited amount of action which can be imposed. There is only limited amount of, let's suppose, interventions which can be made by external factors. So, there lies the conundrum, and there lies the basic problem, as has been mentioned in the article, that what should be done, that predicament, that doubt, that what can be the course of measure which can be followed. Till now, there have been two broader mechanisms which have been followed to highlight the human rights violations. If you take a look at the two broader pathways which are taken, then one of the pathways is sanctions. Sanctions. Sanctions are imposed on the countries. Now, these sanctions basically can be economic, military sanctions, etc. So, like this, you have sanctions which are imposed, which in a way nudges the states to follow the human rights or to take a notice of human rights violations. For example, let us take the case of our neighboring country of Bangladesh. We all know that Bangladesh has been in turmoil. Now, in the month of January, when Bangladesh had its elections, at that point of time, the entire process of election was doubted upon, about the veracity of the elections, about how authentic the elections were, because significant amount of opposition members were jailed, the opposition parties were banned. So, it was in all fairness referred to as a shambolic election or election for the world, but in reality, it was a contravention of the democratic ideals. Now, what countries like US started doing? They started putting or imposing sanctions on the Bangladeshi officials, the government officials. Their travel ban, etc. would be imposed. Now, the aim was that this would eventually force Bangladesh to look into the various democratic violations and human right violations in terms of imprisonment of the opposition members and imprisonment for the civil society organizations as well. Then, for example, consider the case of North Korea. In the case of North Korea also, you have significant amount of human rights violations. People are not allowed to move out of North Korea, and there are significant amount of deprivations carried out for the population in that region. Now, there also sanctions have been imposed. But there is a kind of a limited outcome or a limited achievement which can be gained from this. Because in many of the cases, the people holding on to the power, they become so resilient and they become so rigid that everything else starts appearing to look like a conspiracy. And that is when the human rights violations keep on continuing in a country without much particular action. Now, the other course of action which the global order follows is basically the act of naming and shaming. Now, what is that? Naming and shaming. For example, let's suppose you come across a petition that signed this petition for in support of the human rights violations in Xinjiang region, signed this petition to support the Tibetans' rights for human rights and the violations which are being carried out by the Chinese authority. So, all these petitions which are circulated and the global reports which are generated, that is an act of naming and shaming a country. For example, when you talk about, let's suppose, Amnesty International coming out with a report that human rights violations have been observed in Russia, human rights violations have been observed in China. So, that is the purpose of naming and shaming. Now, while this also has got a limited amount of outcome, one has to understand that the purpose that it solves is basically that future violations by a particular country, that ceases to exist. Let me elaborate upon the fact. Let's suppose China is carrying out deprivations in the region of Tibet. Right? Now, there have been various different reports which have been published in global media, and the entire world is talking about the Tibetan crisis. Now, in that case, while China might not take the proper jurisdictional route for all the violations, but future violations will come to a standstill or will come to a stop, because now the Chinese authority will be more wary about any such news leaking out to the media. So, this is a way of nudge, right? Nudge action. That you nudge that particular country into behavioral change. Obviously, behavioral change is also restricted, and the outcomes are quite limited in this case also. So, these are the two approaches which are adopted. Yes, there is another kind of approach which countries like US take. For example, when we talk about US immediately goes for military interventions. That military intervention needs to be carried out in a region like Iraq or Syria, because the human rights violations are happening in that region. Now, obviously, the outcome of it is never judged, because at the end, many people lose their lives, many people lose their properties, etc., and eventually end up leading a poorer condition of life. So, that is that condition of military intervention which across the world there is a global consensus that these military interventions are a thing of the past century, and these interventions, they are merely a lie in order to propagate your own national agenda in that region. So, we are left with these two particular pathways. While when we talk about sanctions and military sanctions and the aspect of bringing them to justice, it has worked in certain African countries, it has worked in certain South American regimes where people have been brought to justice. Those who have violated the human rights, they have been taken to the International Criminal Court and so on, and ICJ, and they have been brought to justice. But again, it is restricted in its reach. So, here what needs to be done? What is the way forward? So, before we analyze the way forward, let us understand why is it that this naming and shaming and this particular pathway of sanctions, why is it that people are not paying attention to it? If let's suppose there is a news article regarding the human rights violations in any part of our country, lot of us, we don't take that seriously, or depending upon which part of the political divide you are in, you tend to believe or discard that news article. Why is that? That is because the world believes or the world behaves even on perception. Action is important, but perception is also important. That what you are appearing to be doing. So, there is a greater sense of dissatisfaction amongst various different members of the global order, that when it comes to human rights, the human rights and the cases associated with human rights, they are West driven. West driven. That is, when you experience or when you observe a news headline regarding a racial violence or a racial discrimination happening, let's suppose in United States or in western part of Europe, so much amount of hue and cry is not made. But when you have subsequent human rights violation in, let's suppose, any part of Asia, any part of Africa, any part of South America, lot of hue and cry is made. So, that is where the regimes in power, they oftentimes take a look at even the news headlines for these human rights violations as West driven. And then there is another aspect about the timing and the agenda driven shaming. Timing and agenda driven. Naming and shaming. What is that? So, for example, and it has been over a period of time, now we have the benefit of hindsight. So, over a period of time, we know about it for certainty that there have been various different sudden increased frequencies of human right violation news headlines, and they coming to prominence when talks between two countries, they start to fail. For example, in our own case, if you take a look at our own case, now there has been a recorded incident where, for example, when you had the US officials coming to India in order to convince India to declare its net zero goals by a particular period of time, that is 2050, India did not agree to that, and India put its net zero goals to 2070. Now, there were a flurry of US officials and European Union officials making a visit to India to convince India and nudge India to declare its goal as 2050. Now, as soon as India made that announcement in Conference of Parties in 2021, that is the Conference of Parties 26, that our net zero goal is 2070, immediately after that, you had a flurry of news articles across all the Western media press about the human rights violations being carried out in different parts of the country. While that was suppressed previously, but then it started appearing. Now, that raises suspicion. Now, when you talk about the human rights violation, human rights are significantly violated in the region of Saudi Arabia and in many countries of the Middle East. While various different organizations such as the Amnesty International, etc., they keep on highlighting about these human rights violations which happen in, let's suppose, Iran or certain countries which are not very friendly to the Western countries. But then they go silent when it comes to human rights violation in, let's suppose, Israel, when it comes to human rights violation, let's suppose, in Saudi Arabia. So, that is where it raises the suspicion that it is basically agenda driven, and that puts the entire aspect or the entire exercise in doubt. And then even if a news report is generated about for the naming and shaming of a particular regime or a country, it is never believed that authenticity is lost forever. So, the damage which is caused to the global order and the global order for reinforcement of human rights, that is irreparable. So, first of all, one needs to solve these issues, and that is where one needs to observe, and the Amnesty International, etc., they need to be voicing their opinion even when you have human rights violations happening in the Western countries and in the allies of the Western countries. So, that needs to be highlighted and also amplified, so that Amnesty International is not only impartial, but is seen to be impartial for greater belief. Then, for once you have that authenticity which has been established. So, establishment of authenticity. That is very important. Another aspect is that one has to distinguish between institutions and individuals. Institutions and individuals. Human rights have to be driven from the institutions. For any particular country, if you consider any regime, any particular country in any part of the world, when you observe the human rights violations at an increasing frequency, those violations are driven from the individualistic perspective. The people in power, when they gain a kind of an authoritarian tendency, that is when these violations they start to happen. So, when you are trying to basically instill that or provide that human rights sense in that country, it has to be institution driven. Because one thing you have to understand is that institutions, they are always driven by law. Regardless of whichever country that you talk about, institutions, they always basically implement the norms and the laws. Whereas individuals, they are driven by power. So, what needs to be done is that you need to strengthen the institutions, advocate for strengthening of that institutional law implementing mechanism in these countries, so that a bridge between the law and power that is instilled, so that people in power, they do not deviate from the law of the land and they implement the law of the land. So that is why a bridge is very important, because once this bridge is built, then what will happen? All the individualistic tendencies which end up violating the human rights, for example, various individuals that you consider, be it the case of China, be it the case of North Korea. Now, in all of these cases, you will observe that the people in power, they are able to convince the masses that this human right violation, etc., which is happening, is not reality. Basically, they are acting against the oppressors, they are acting against the tyranny of colonialism, they are acting against the tyranny of the Western powers, and so on. So, there is a lot of scope for false rhetoric. There is a lot of scope and actual implementation of propaganda machinery. Right. So, as a consequence of that, what happens? Human rights goes out of the window. So, to curb that individualistic tendency, this bridge must be built and institutions need to be strengthened. There also has to be a greater amount of media attention for almost every region. It need not be concentrated upon the Western countries. Anywhere where there is a human rights violation, that needs to be talked about. Domestic presses, if they are independent and free enough, they need to amplify that voice. And basically, the international press needs to also talk about it. And that too in an impartial manner, not in an agenda-driven manner. Agenda-driven manner, for example, you hear something in Russia, then the normal perception which is built that Russia has been doing this historically. So, it is in the DNA of the Russian authority to violate the human rights. That is an absolute wrong mechanism where you risk antagonizing the people in power and then they become more stubborn and do not take any action further. So, impartiality, authenticity, universal coverage, and then building a bridge for institution-driven mechanism and bridge between power and the law, so that these institutions are strengthened for the permanency of human rights in these individual jurisdictions. Okay? So, what we have seen, what is the predicament faced across the globe when it comes to implementation of human rights? What are the pathways which are chosen by the countries where they are having a significant amount of effect and where there is a limitation, and how to get rid of the limitation and how to implement the human rights. Okay? Now, let us take a look at the practice question, a statement based question which can be always framed from here. Failure to ensure human rights in countries is a failure of international order. Discuss the push and pulls of implementing human rights across different sections of the world. So, what is this question about? First of all, infer the meaning of the question. The meaning of the question is that you have various different areas where human rights are not being implemented, and that is a failure of the global order. What are the challenges and what are the various different opportunities when it comes to implementation of human rights and the way forward around it? So, something that we have discussed. So, basically, how do you introduce such a kind of a question? So, you can start with a quotation also. For example, you can quote Martin Luther King Jr., where he said that injustice anywhere is the lack of justice everywhere. So, you can use these quotations, and basically, if you remember it by verbatim, then put it within the quotes. Otherwise, as Martin Luther King famously said, and then mention it in a statement. So, that can be one method of introducing your answer. Okay, that is very effective, and that will only be the introduction. Let's suppose you are choosing to introduce, or you are not able to memorize any of these quotations, then what you do? In that case, you start talking about the importance of human rights in attainment of an individual's own capacity, and how important human rights are and implementation of human rights are for the attainment of one's own ideals and the attainment of the ideals of humanity. Once you have done that, then you talk about that in the body portion. After you then migrate into the body portion, there you talk about that human right violations and incidents of these violations have become quite frequent and prominent across various different parts of the globe. Give the example of the Uyghur community in China, the Tibetan region in China, North Korea, Russia. You can give the example of these. Saudi Arabia, Iran, you can quote them. After you have quoted them, then you talk about that this is a failure of the international order, and basically where humanity has not been able to succeed in ensuring justice to the fellow citizens or the fellow members of the global community. So there are certain challenges that they face. What are the challenges? So list out the challenges. Then talk about the approaches taken for implementation of human rights, where you talk about the sanctions, give the example, talk about the naming and shaming, give the example of Amnesty International. If possible, try to do it in a flowchart manner or a bubble manner so that your answer doesn't appear to be very textual and it is in a good presentation. After that, talk about what is the way forward. So how do you introduce the way forward? So despite these challenges, there can be certain measures which can be taken in order to ensure that human right becomes a global necessity and a global requirement rather than a selective implementation. So certain measures which can be taken are, then talk about authenticity, impartiality, talk about the bridge between or institutional driven mechanisms, talk about the bridge between power and law, and then eventually in your conclusion, talk about the success of mankind lies in its common intelligence and its common coexistence. That coexistence is put at great risk every day due to the violations which happen in one part or the other. The need of the hour is to pay attention to these violations and get curative action as soon as possible so that the world is a beautiful place to live or the place that we dream to be in. Like that, you can compose the answer for 250 words. Try writing it on your own and try various different types of presentation mechanism that you can bring to the table. Now, coming to the second article of the day. The second article is power play. Now, this is about the hydroelectric power project which is being implemented across the river Teesta and the various issues which have been faced there. Now, Teesta is a tributary of Brahmaputra. Now, Teesta originates in North Sikkim, covers the region of Sikkim, moves through the region of West Bengal, and then enters into Bangladesh through the Cooch Behar region of Bangladesh. Now, here, when we talk about river Teesta, now it is through the region of Sikkim, it is in a youthful stage, young stage river. It has got a lot of velocity, lot of power associated with that, and that is why it is oftentimes cited as a perfect region which can generate or fulfill our energy demands and provide us with our energy security. Now, you had various different memorandums, various different types of proposals given to us for decades now by various different committees formed by the government of India, which talked about, to one extent, providing hydroelectric power or building hydroelectric projects at more than 100 sites across river Teesta. But what we have been observing since the past year is quite alarming. For example, you had the glacial lake outburst flood across the same river Teesta, which happened last year, which claimed many lives and which brought the power project in Teesta 3 to a complete standstill. Then, day before yesterday, you had a landslide across the Teesta 5 project. Even though, thankfully, that did not claim any casualties, but still, it brought the entire region to a standstill. So again, that raises the basic question of the fragility of the Himalayan ecosystem and what can be done going ahead. Because you have to understand that hydroelectric power is one of the cleaner mechanisms of producing power. A country like India, which still significantly relies on thermal power generated from coal, now that is causing increased amount of emission. So today or tomorrow, we have to diverge away from the coal generated thermal power. We basically have to adopt these methods of renewable power energy. Now what do we do for that? So here, before we take a look into the problem in greater detail, it is very ideal and only apt to show you the region of Sikkim and various different power projects and hydroelectric power projects which are in the phase of consideration, implementation, and also in certain cases power generation. So all these black barricades that you see, these are basically the proposed or the constructed hydroelectric power plants. Now you can observe almost the entire region of Sikkim is flooded with these kind of proposals for the projects. Now that poses a significant amount of danger. So when we talk about hydropower projects, particularly in a fragile ecosystem like the Himalayas, what will be the impact? The first impact is that you have to understand that Himalayas, they are not a stable terrain. There the height is still increasing. The land or the ground underneath the region of the Himalayas, that is moving. The Indian plate is moving underneath the Eurasian plate, and the mountains, they are further increasing in height. So it is already a seismically very sensitive zone, lies in zone 5, which means there is always a great probability of a high magnitude earthquake occurring there. On top of that, if you construct these particular kind of reservoirs and these kind of hydroelectric power projects, that can always have the tendency to induce reservoir induced seismicity. What is that? This is basically when you have the construction of a reservoir destabilizing the region or the topography to such an extent that it can cause seismic action. For example, just to give you an idea, let's suppose you consider a hilly region. Let's suppose you construct a dam in this area, and then you store water and you fill the reservoir in that entire region. Now one has to understand that this concrete dam that is constructed, that imposes a lot of weight on the ground surface. But on top of that, all the water, the millions of gallons of water which are stored, that also imposes a lot of weight. Now when you have the topography which is unstable, like the case of the Himalayas, there is a tendency for development of certain cracks across the region. Certain cracks can develop. And you see, because you have so much amount of weight of water on top or the weight of concrete on top, now these cracks start to deepen and they become more extended. Eventually what happens is that through these cracks, water starts filling these cracks. Water starts penetrating and starts filling these cracks. That acts as a lubricant between the rocks. So the rocks are prone to sliding over each other. And whenever the rocks can slide, that will always induce an earthquake. And imagine a kind of an earthquake in the fragile ecosystem like the Himalayas, that can immediately break this concrete barrier. And all this stored potential energy of water will be unleashed downstream, that is to the lower elevation. So you can imagine millions of gallons of water coming downslope, downhill, because all these regions are at an elevation. So when they can come downslope, that can have a detrimental impact on the livelihoods, lives, and entire settlement across the region of the river system. So it can be devastating, to say the least. We already have few of these systems or few of these hydropower projects and reservoirs which have been constructed in sensitive zones. For example, the new Tehri Dam in Uttarakhand lies in a seismic zone. Just as the construction was continuing or construction was happening in the new Tehri Dam in the early 90s, the region experienced a massive earthquake. Since that point of time, the region has been seismically silent, but does not mean it will always be seismically silent. Then when you talk about the Subansiri project in the region of Arunachal, you talk about the Teesta project in the region of Sikkim. These are in the fragile ecosystems. There can always be the case of reservoir-induced seismicity. Then, when you construct these reservoirs or the dams, you clear out a lot of area through blasting and by various different construction activities. What it leads to is the fact that, let's suppose earlier, this region had a slope like this. But because you had to construct the reservoir, you basically have removed this slope. You have removed the slope. Now, the slope that has come out, that is not the natural slope of the region, is it? It is basically leading to the destabilization of the slope in that particular area. So, that slope destabilization can always induce landslides or other kind of mass movements, and those landslides will have a detrimental impact. Then disturbance to the natural flow of streams. Now, you have to understand that in the region of the Himalayas in particular, all these streams, they pack a lot of power. They are in their youthful stage. So, when these streams, they are stored or they are diverted, that impacts the sedimentation rate, and that impacts where they can lead to the slide and the falls. So, that is where the natural ecosystem can get damaged. So, here what is the way forward? Basically, we need hydroelectric power. We have already talked about it. So, what is the way forward? So, one is environmental impact assessment to be carried out in greater detail. And when we say environmental impact assessment, in majority of the cases nowadays, the EIA which is being carried out is so very superficial that it only talks about, okay, these many plants will be submerged, this much area will be submerged, here you have habitation, that's it. You need to understand, or there needs to be a detailing of where the slope will have an impact, where there can be landslides, where there can be the impact of earthquakes, and what can be the future cost. So, that future cost needs to be considered in the environmental impact assessment. Then, avoidance of geologically sensitive areas or seismically active zones, and if you are able to generate, or if we want to generate electricity from the youthful stage of the rivers, which is ideal for generation of electricity, one should go for the run of river project rather than the reservoir based project. What is the run of the river project? There you don't construct a large dam, or there you don't have a large reservoir to fill up. What you do is, you simply channelize the river water through a particular path, and thereby you don't even disturb the natural flow to such an extent. But that channelization would mean that you place a turbine. So, for example, let's suppose a river is flowing like this. Now, what you do is, you provide an alternate channel, and here you place the turbine generator and the power system, and then the water is fed back into the channel of the river. So, that run of the river projects after proper EIA can be carried out, and this will have lesser impact on the eco-sensitivity or the region environmentally. Okay? Let us take a look at the question. Discuss the impact of hydropower projects in the fragile Himalayan ecosystem. Now, here when you write the introduction of this answer, you can choose any of the two subjects here. There are two subjects here, hydropower projects and fragile Himalayan ecosystem. You can choose to begin your answer from any of them. If let's suppose you choose to start from the Himalayan ecosystem, talk about in the introduction about the fact that the region of the Himalayas is tectonically unstable and geologically very active. Construction activities in that region have the proposition of danger for the future. So, like that you can write the introduction. Then you talk about the necessity for energy security of the country, for which hydroelectric power projects are an important constituent. Now, these hydroelectric power projects, they utilize the kinetic energy of the water, and for that the youthful stage of the river needs to be tapped. However, there are certain issues, and then talk about the challenges. What are the challenges for the hydroelectric power projects in the Himalayan region? Talk about RIS, talk about slope destabilization, and so on. Then you can talk about that in order to solve these, or in order to have an or environmentally sustainable construction, what can be done? So then talk about the measures forward, and eventually you have to talk, in the conclusion, you have to talk about the fact that Himalayas, which form a natural frontier for India, are very fragile and vital ecosystems, not only for the biodiversity but also for the millions of people that the river systems there support. Any disturbance or fragility in that region will have long-term consequences on water security, food security of the country at large. So the need of the hour is to preserve them, conserve them to the best possible measure. So like that, you can end the answer. Okay? Now, coming to the third article, that is imports weaken Indian pharma. Now, this article owes its origin from a government order which has allowed for the import of certain drugs, that is the certain medicines from foreign vendors. And in certain cases, you also have the name of the medicine mentioned, the name of the company from which it has to be imported. This follows the budgetary action where 10 to 12% of custom duty was waived off from certain drugs which are, for example, anti-diabetes and anti-cancer drugs, to make them cheaper in India. So that is what this article argues, that all this import facilitation which is being done, it is going to impact the Indian pharma industry in a negative manner. So here, it talks about the fact that Indian pharma industry is a budding industry. We are also referred to as the pharmacy of the world. India is known for its ability to manufacture generic medicines, right? I hope we understand the meaning of generic medicines. So, generic medicines, for example, let's suppose AstraZeneca. Let's suppose AstraZeneca has come out with a particular medicine for diabetes. Now, it will have a brand of AstraZeneca, it will have a particular chemical composition. So, that brand will give it some amount of value. Now, utilizing that chemical composition, let's suppose you manufacture your own tablets, but you don't give that brand. So, it will be cheaper, right? Similar to, let's suppose you go to the market to buy a cloth or buy a jacket. Now, you see a jacket with Adidas or Nike that will be priced at a higher range. But then you have a non-branded jacket which will do the same purpose at a cheaper rate, right? So that is the system of the generic medicines. So the chemical composition is the same, but then it is unbranded, so it is cheaper and within the range of the common public. Now these are also, many of the times, you have them being referred to as the biosimilars. That is, biologically and chemical composition is quite similar to the branded medicine, but then they are cheaper. Now you see, in a country like India, the requirement of generic medicine is quite significant. For example, when we talk about the common population, the normal population, still our per capita income is around $2,500, which is not very huge, which is quite significantly low. Now, a low per capita income country like India has got close to around a normal individual, a common man on an average, basically incurs around 48% of his out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare. That means if I have rupees 100 with me, a normal individual spends 48 rupees out of that 100 on buying medicines. So out-of-pocket expenditure for medicines for healthcare is already quite high in a country like India. So the need of the hour is to make these medicines cheaper. So for that, what do you need? You need domestic manufacturing. You need the manufacturing to come from our own country. So that is what the article argues, that import from various different countries defies the entire purpose. But what about those medicines for which we do not have the know-how? Those medicines for which we don't have the chemical composition and it is patented by any particular company like Pfizer or Moderna or let's suppose AstraZeneca, they have patented these medicines. What to do in that case? So, the writers of the article argue that look, the Patent Act basically has a room for that also. We will take a look at that, but the issues highlighted due to the imports. It impacts the domestic production, higher cost involved means higher out of pocket expenditure, a higher out of pocket expenditure. Then establishes the market monopoly. So, if you are importing medicines from only AstraZeneca or only Pfizer, then it will establish their market monopoly. They can jack up the prices whenever they want, or they can control the pricing mechanism of the market. So, it will put the consumers at loss. So, here basically what is argued is the provisions under section 83 and section 100 of the Patent Act. So, what do they state? So, basically patents are granted, section 83 states, patents are granted to encourage inventions and to secure that the inventions are worked in India on a commercial scale and to the fullest extent that is reasonably practicable without undue delay, okay? And they are not granted merely to enable patentees to enjoy a monopoly. So, basically consumer is placed at a prime importance, that provide the patent so that it is workable, it is implementable quickly, and consumers are not harmed because monopoly should not be established. Seeking the patent to establish monopoly is not allowed. It also states that patents are granted to make the benefit of the patented invention available at reasonably affordable prices to the public. That is where you cannot have high cost medicines. Then the section 100 of the Patent Act states that patents granted do not in any way prohibit the central government in taking measures to protect public health. So, that means if a country like Pfizer, let us suppose Pfizer, has manufactured an anti-diabetes drug, let us name that drug ABC. Okay. Now, that ABC is priced at rupees 1 lakh per pill, per tablet. It is 1 lakh. There are medicines to that range. Now, the Patent Act gives the provision that the Indian government, can generate licenses, okay, can generate licenses for any domestic manufacturer, let us name that XYZ. So, that is the compulsory license, what is also referred to as the CL. So, CL can be granted for the domestic manufacturer to manufacture this same drug at a lower price. So, in that case, the patent protection to Pfizer does not come into place. Now, Indian government has done that before. You had a drug which was manufactured, which was priced at rupees 3 lakh. Now, Indian government provided that compulsory licensing for that generic manufacturing of the drug to be manufactured at rupees 8,000. Now, that raised a lot of hue and cry across the world. The matter was taken up till the WTO, and you had a lot of sentiments against the Indian business environment. Again, a lot of articles were furnished in the Western media and so on. But then, when you have a larger public which is below poverty line, a significant amount of population, you cannot have costly drugs present. So, here the article argues that biosimilars or the generic medicines, they are not being manufactured at the same rate, but also there is a significant amount of delay in approving the generic medicines or biosimilars, because our law mandates that even when you have a generic medicine, then in India also you have to carry out the clinical trials Let me explain that. So, this ABC has been manufactured in, let's suppose, the US. Now, this ABC drug would have been successful or would have been provided to the public only after the clinical trials, the animal trials, then the human trials, all of them would have taken place. Then ABC would have come to the market. Our law specifies that when this ABC has to be introduced into India, then there needs to be carried out human trials even in India. Now, while the article argues that this is a wrong move and not many countries, they adopt this practice, but there is a strong argument against this also. The argument that why we need to carry out human trials for these drugs even in India. And the argument is very simple. It is the fact that our body's composition, our genetic makeup is not similar to every other genetic makeup across the globe. You have people who are more immune to certain kind of characteristics or chemicals, people who are more immune or more susceptible rather to certain diseases. And that varies from one genome sequencing to another. So, that is why when you have a medicine being introduced over India, it is only important and very, very pertinent to carry out the drug trials in India on the Indian citizens, on the people having the same genetic makeup, so that we are able to pick forward any kind of discrepancies which come up. That is very important. Otherwise, the companies eventually will shrug off any liability for future disasters, etc., which can happen, that it was not my responsibility. So, that is why it is important to basically talk about or to give these animal trials. Now, what is the way forward? What can be done going ahead? First things first, we need to improve the R&D, research and development in pharmacy. Now, till now, when we talk about pharmaceutical industry in India, that is largely known for making biosimilars and generic medicines. You do not have newer medicines and newer medicinal interventions and inventions coming out of India. So, rather than simply being a copy paste, it is high time that we start generating our own kind of research and development in pharmacy sector, and for that we need to be at a forefront for investment in R&D in pharmaceuticals, so that we are not dependent on the foreign companies, we manufacture our own medicines. So, R&D is a must. And for that, even the active pharmaceutical ingredients, that is APIs. Now, these APIs, earlier India used to be a significantly rich manufacturer of APIs, but in the late 2000s, you basically had the condition where in the early 2000s, you basically had that import was allowed for the APIs from China. As a result of that, these active pharmaceutical ingredients which provide the property to these particular medicines, now the entire sector in India experienced a shutdown because cheaper imports were allowed from China for manufacturing of generic medicines. So, while the generic medicine sector thrived, the innovation and the active pharmaceutical ingredients which are necessary for them, they were being imported. The government policy has been reverted a couple of years back, where again these APIs, they are being promoted to be manufactured in India, and that is a learning that we have from COVID. And then other than that, compulsory licensing needs to be provided for not all the medicines, but the medicines which are exorbitantly priced. Monopoly, establishment of monopoly needs to be stopped. Monopoly needs to be stopped. Okay? But at the same time, one also has to ensure that in order to achieve these goals, we do not let the patient suffer because of the lack of medicines. So, one has to be sensible about it, that if you have an anti-cancer drug which is in deficiency in India, import it if required, provide subsidization if required, but then allow that medicine to come in. It should not be the case where, because we are against imports and because we are waiting for the domestic industry to come up to its legs, people lose their life in between these policy framework. So we should not be absolutely rigid. We have to remember science progresses only when shared and not in isolation. Okay? So here we have talked about the issue with regards to the imports and what can be done moving ahead. Now, coming to certain articles which we will discuss briefly relevant for your prelims. So WHO has started investigating the suspected new polio case which has emerged in Meghalaya. Now, in the region of Meghalaya, we had discussed about it yesterday also, that the poliomyelitis case which has come up or which has been detected, it has been a vaccine derived polio case rather than a case of wild polio. Now, vaccine derived polio virus, that is basically because when you apply the polio vaccine, there at the time of the application, you have weakened polio virus which is injected or which is provided into the body. Now, if the immune system is very, very weak, then even that weakened virus can impact the body. Now, it has come to light that the region of Meghalaya where it has been observed, though that region has typically been anti-vaccine and they have always hesitated from taking vaccines. So, that basically automatically implies that their natural immune system against the polio virus would not have been significantly stronger. So, that is why this young one could be impacted by poliomyelitis. But at the same time, it poses a risk that the future generations in that region will again refrain from taking the vaccine anymore. Because now the common case will come that that individual had taken the vaccine, look how that individual suffered. So, WHO has started monitoring it and has started monitoring the entire situation and the entire region as well. So, if there have been or if it is found that it is not a vaccine derived polio virus, if it is a new strain of polio virus, then WHO can issue a directive. One has to recall that WHO had issued a directive in 2014 to basically make India or declare India as polio free. And that was typically because since 2011, no new polio cases had been registered or had been found there. Okay? So, that is about the WHO monitoring. More news shall come up in the coming weeks about it. Now, Supreme Court to examine the need for environmental regulator. So, the Supreme Court basically is going to mull upon the idea that do we need a kind of a regulator for all the environmental actions and environmental regulations which are happening. Because as of now, what we are facing is that you have multiplicity of various different institutions, multiplicity of various different organizations, and these organizations oftentimes they work in silos. For example, you have Central Pollution Control Board, you have National Green Tribunal. So, all these they work in silos. They have their own unique specializations, and that means certain areas of focus they go out of attention. So, that is why in order to bring forward all these under one overarching agency, that is where the argument comes that you should have one regulator, just like you have the regulator for telecom in the form of TRAI, or you have a regulator in the case of electricity sector. So, should we have a regulator for the environmental sector also? The arguments against this is very simple, that this can end up being just another body and just another kind of bureaucratic mechanism which can lead to the further delay in environmental action and environmental processes. So, it can further complicate the environmental mechanism rather than leading to a quick action. So, there is an argument for, there is an argument against. Okay? Now, here rapid e-commerce growth could hit millions of retail stores and jobs. Now, this is a statement made by the Commerce and Industry Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal. Now, basically, this statement, which was seen to be making quite a splash across the market since yesterday. Now, this statement was made on the sidelines of an event where basically a report was tabled by EY, the Ernst & Young, which is a consultancy firm. So, EY had tabled a report about the e-commerce sector in India and how it is enabling the local communities and how it is helping the local communities. But the minister, straightforward, he disagreed with the report and disagreed with the findings, and he said that all these e-commerce giants, and he named Amazon in particular, that these are the ones who are exploiting the local population and the local ration shops. He gave the example that if you take a look back or take the clock back to 10 years from today, so there 10 years ago, in every street, you could find various different shops selling mobile phones, electronic gadgets, etc. Now, all of them have closed up. Is it the case that people are not buying the mobile phones? On the contrary, people are buying more number of mobile phones, but all of them are being sold by these e-commerce platforms. Now, he also made a particular statement that these e-commerce platforms, they are indulging in what is the predatory pricing. Predatory pricing. What is this predatory pricing? Basically, let's suppose if I have to sell this pen. Now, the market rate of the pen is 50 rupees. Now, I want people to come to my platform, so I will sell it at 5 rupees. So, the people who are selling it at 50 rupees, now they will start incurring losses. Nobody will go to them. They will have to shut the shop. So, that is what the allegation is, and that is what the argument is, that all these e-commerce platforms, particularly Amazon, they are incurring annual losses to the tune of rupees 6,000 crores, which is huge. 6,000 crores of loss has been posted by Amazon in India. Now, that is particularly indicative of the fact that they have involved themselves or they have indulged in predatory pricing, putting the local retail shop out of circulation, out of business, and basically endangering millions of jobs in the retail sector. He also pointed to the fact that all these e-commerce platforms, as per the press release of 2016, they are allowed to sell B2B. That is, they are allowed to sell only to businesses. They are not allowed to sell directly to consumers. So, if they have to sell to the consumers, they basically have to get into partnership with one of the retailers or manufacturers in India, and they can sell it to the consumers. But they are openly flouting the norms. So, that is what the endangerment for the jobs and the retail sector in India is, where the future appears to be very bleak for the large section of unorganized retail shop owners and millions of people who are employed there. Now, then coming to the last article of the day, and that is from the international edition in the science section of the newspaper, and that is Earth whistles when lightning strikes and there is a new melody. So, basically, it is about a new finding, a new research which has come to light. Now, what the research talks about is the fact that when there are lightning strikes, particularly in the lower latitudes. Now, lightning strikes happen why? Lightning strikes happen when the clouds, they develop a kind of a charge. When they develop a charge, that is when the lightning strikes, right? The charge flows from the cloud to the ground. Now, the argument is that this charge oftentimes also induces the lightning to escape into the ionosphere and from there into the magnetosphere of planet Earth. So, what is this magnetosphere of Earth? So, Earth basically, because of the molten outer core which is rotating, that is iron and nickel dominated outer core, the Earth behaves like a bar magnet. So, it extends its magnetic field all around the surface, and that establishes a kind of a magnetosphere. Magnetosphere is very important for survival of life on planet Earth. Because had it not been for the magnetosphere, our planet and its atmosphere would have been bombarded by the solar particles and the charge from the sun, and it would have completely stripped off Earth's atmosphere. Something that we see in Mars. Mars doesn't have a magnetosphere. So observe that the atmosphere has been stripped off. Life is not possible there. So the only reason that the Earth is able to sustain the atmospheric gases and integrity of atmosphere is because of that magnetic shield around us, that is the magnetosphere. Now within this magnetosphere, this is basically an indication of the magnetosphere. Now within this, oftentimes you have the charged particles from the sun which gets trapped in certain sections. Lot of charged particles of the sun, they get trapped. Now that forms what is referred to as the Van Allen belt. That Van Allen belt, which is at a considerable height from planet Earth, this consists of regions where you have very high amount of radiation. Radiation is so powerful that it can impact human space flight, it can impact the satellites, it can impact even the various different flight paths and the various different communication mechanism provided in these regions. So that is why Van Allen belt is an important area which is studied for human space flight. Even when man was traveling to the moon in the Apollo missions, you basically had a kind of a fixture where the speed would be increased when the spacecraft was flying through the Van Allen belt, so that human exposure to these X-rays is very, very less. Basically, the radiation trapped from the solar particles is in the form of X-rays. So that is why Van Allen belt becomes important for future space flights. We are targeting Mars in the future, so it becomes important to study. Now, the new study has found out that these lightning strikes, they puncture into the ionosphere and they then get trapped into the magnetosphere of the planet Earth. Mind you, lightning is also the movement of charged particles. So when they are getting trapped into the magnetosphere, that is where they can interfere with the Van Allen belt. They can provide disturbances or distortions in the Van Allen belt. So that is something which needs to be kept in mind for future space missions, and for that more study needs to be carried out. It also talks about the fact that these lightning strikes, after they travel into the ionosphere, they follow the magnetic field lines of Earth from geographical north to geographical south pole, just like train on rails. They follow that path, and while they are following that path, they provide a kind of a whistling sound in frequency which is even audible to us, but obviously at a greater elevation. So that is what this article is about. So from here, for the prelims, what you need to extract? What is magnetosphere? Why it is important for life on Earth? What is the Van Allen belt? Here, charged particles from the sun get trapped into the magnetosphere, having high amount of X-rays and high amount of radiation potential. Why Van Allen belt study is important? For human space flight. And what is the impact of these lightning strikes? They can puncture into the magnetosphere and impact the Van Allen belt. Okay? So that basically brings us to the end of the discussion for today. I hope the session was helpful and has added some amount of content to your already existing knowledge set. If you have liked the session, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.